Welcome to the Awe and Wonder podcast. This is Series 6, More Leaders and Changemakers. In every podcast episode, we're striving to bring together families and educators, therapists, community partners, and leaders in the field of assistive technology. And in this series, the Leaders and Changemakers series, we're focused on the person and what they've accomplished, what their beliefs are, and the impacts that they've made and then they hope to make in their career or their lives. And today we're thrilled to be joined by a very special guest who is certainly a leader in the field of special education, Assistant Secretary Glenna Gallo. Glenna is the Assistant Secretary of the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services at the United States Department of Education, where she serves as an advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Education on matters related to education of children and youth with disabilities, and as well as employment and community living for youth and adults with disabilities. So welcome, Glenna.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here with you today.
We're really excited too.
Yeah.
Glenna, we're familiar with you from your time in Washington State as the OSPI Special Education Director and Assistant Superintendent of OSPI from 2017 to 2022. And Kristen Leslie, the Director of the Special Education Technology Center, worked closely with you as we did, all of us at SETC. And we were so fortunate to work with Glenna because she was in that leadership role in Washington, and she was really instrumental in working to remove silos, to encourage working across all departments to really serve all kids. Glenna, we see you as an advocate, a true advocate for assistive technology and for Tier 1 technology for inclusion. So we're just thrilled to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time out of what we know is probably a crazy busy schedule to join us on our podcast today. We'd like to start by asking, just what is it like, the day in the life of the Assistant Secretary of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services at the U.S. Department of Education? It's such a mouthful, but it's such an amazing title. And when you left Washington to start this role, we were really excited for you, and we want to hear more about it.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I really enjoyed my work in Washington State as I enjoy my work now. I'm very fortunate in that I've never had a job I didn't love. And this is another opportunity to do things that I love and that I'm passionate about. I can tell you, your question was, what does a typical day look like? And there is not a typical day, or in a year and a half, I have not yet seen one. Because every day is very different, and some days roll along exactly like what I was expecting and what my calendar says was going to happen, and other days do not look at all like what I was expecting. But what I will say is that I try to make sure that my daily activities always include the areas that impact outcomes and expectations for individuals with disabilities. And to me, that's very important because that's why I went into this work as a person with a disability, as a parent of daughters with disabilities, and as a former educator and as a former, administrator. To me, the reason I do this work is to impact outcomes and to improve outcomes for individuals with disabilities. And so I have found very early on that if I'm not doing that work on a day-to-day basis, then I kind of lose my will, right? And my purpose and the value that I bring. And so I've identified that has to be part of my daily activity. My office is unique in that we're the only section in the U.S. Department of Ed that works across all ages, from our youngest children, our infants and toddlers with disabilities, to adults with disabilities. So we have on one side the Office of Special Education Programs that works with individuals from birth through 22 generally. And then we have the Rehabilitation Services Administration, or RSA, which works with state vocational rehabilitation agencies around employment, supports, training, and moving individuals with disabilities towards competitive integrated employment. And so that's a unique office here in the Department of Ed. And we are very fortunate to be led by Secretary Cardona, who is a former educator himself and whose daughter is going to school to be a special ed teacher. So he has his own kind of connection to this field beyond that of an educator.
I love to hear that. And you have family in education, you said? It,
So my youngest daughter was in school to be a special ed teacher. She is taking a break. She's gone a different path right now. She and her older sister are in business together. They're entrepreneurs.
ooh.
Um, but I know, very scary and very exciting as a parent.
We were going to ask you kind of what is your why? Why are you in this field? You have a personal relationship with having a disability. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, or any supports that you've experienced?
Definitely. I mean, I think that when I consider like where I am today and the road that got me here, this is not really what I intended ever to do as part of my career. And when I think back to the people who inspired me, it's really made up of a mixture of people. I mean, I can go back to when I was in middle school and my next door neighbor's mom was getting her master's in special ed and used to take us every summer to the preschool on the UNLV campus
Mm.
to help, you know, in the summer. And that was an inclusive preschool setting.
Oh,
So we
wow.
had an opportunity to work there. I was an elementary ed major until those classes were full, and I was going to lose my insurance, my health insurance, if I wasn't a full-time student. And so I switched over for one semester into the special ed programs and then realized this was what really drove me. This is the work that I wanted to do and stayed in that program and graduated. Again, as a person with a disability, I was not identified in a timely manner. My parents were military parents and they moved frequently, and my evaluation was delayed several times, and I wasn't identified until I was a senior in high school when they identified me as having a speech language impairment. Unfortunately, it wasn't until I was in my 30s that they identified my hearing impairment, which kind of like brought all of that into perspective. And so the accommodations that I used as a student, you know, both in my K-12 years, as a college student, and that I used as an educator to adjust and address my disability and my accommodation needs were things that I didn't necessarily seek out and think like I need to accommodate for this disability. It was I need a workaround so that I can accomplish what I want to accomplish. Now, I have been very fortunate in that the majority of my life, people have only told me that I can achieve what I wanted to achieve with some very small exceptions. And so I had supportive families, supportive educators, supportive communities who told me that I could do what I wanted to do and helped get me to where I needed to be. And I think that that is so important. I have to tell you, I met with a group of adults with intellectual disabilities who were enrolled in college, and I asked them to talk about one of the things that they were most proud of, you know, their experiences in college. And many of them spoke to the fact that somebody had told them that they wouldn't go to college, whether it was a family member, whether it was a teacher, whether it was a neighbor, that they had been told that that was not something they could do. And they were so proud of themselves for achieving it, for setting that goal and getting there. And that really has helped me identify this commitment, the sense of service that we create with public education and the equity that it provides, and the fact that we need to set up the supports that enable everyone to be successful and to do what they want to do, not what we think they should do or not what we think they should be able to do, but what they want to do. They're going to put in the work, and we need to build the system that supports them.
I love
Mhm.
that. It speaks to how you advocate for people, and it's so nice to see you in this role, to have you in this role where you're able to do that on such a broad level. Another wonderful thing that you were instrumental in is the myths and facts surrounding assistive technology devices and services. And Brenda and I are asking all of our podcast guests in this Leaders and Changemakers series about, as we think about technology and special education, there are things where, it's like we've always done this way, or we've always looked at it this way. We think this certain population can't do this, but we know that's not true anymore, right? Or not anymore, but we know that's not true. But there's always something that sometimes we can kind of get hung up on, a way of thinking or a myth. So it reminds us of this wonderful document that's come out that you were instrumental in creating. And we've heard from a lot of parents who have read this and who are asking us about this, and they're using it as a way to advocate for their own kids in school, because you've taken common myths for assistive technology and then busted them and said, well, hey, that's not true, and here's what you can do. And it's really made it tangible, I think, for people to understand the assistive technology supports more.
Definitely. So thank you so much. I have to tell you, I work with an amazing team here in the department, and they really came through when we talked about this need, when we said we learned a great deal about technology and assistive technology during the pandemic. And there were times of tremendous change and fast change in a fast pace. And what is it that we learned from that? And what can we continue to implement that worked well? And so one of the things that came out of there was we heard common questions come up, and that's where this document, the myths and facts surrounding assistive technology devices and services, came from. One of the things that I'm so excited about is that this was released in January along with the National Educational Technology Plan, or NETP. And the fact that these two documents came out together as companion documents was really pivotal when you think about the use of technology and learning in individuals with disabilities, because it created an opportunity for us to address the needs of all students, including students with disabilities, on the front end with the design of the document and the technical assistance, rather than trying to retrofit it or address the needs of certain populations after the fact. So these two documents came out together. But what I think is helpful to parents and families and individuals with disabilities, as well as educators and leaders, is that it's very plain speak. And so it says, like, here's the question and here's the answer. And it's laid out kind of by subject area so that it's easy to read. You can say, like, I'm curious about funding for assistive technology. Who pays for it? What if my child is 2 versus my child is of transition age, on the other end, and is 16? How does that impact the use of assistive technology? And so being able to lay that out so that people can find the answers to their questions informs them in that process and gives them the information that they need to have really good, strong conversations and plans about their children's needs and the supports that can be provided, as well as what the intent is behind assistive technology. I am an assistive technology user myself, and I have to tell you, one of the things that I love about universal design is that the assistive technology that I need to function at my best also provides supports to other people in the room, right? When I'm using live captions, when I'm using amplified speech, those are things that can benefit others in the room. And there are so many things like this that we can use to elevate learning, elevate conversations and partnership that we just don't think about. And this document really gives us a way to do that.
Well, I think you make a good point. I think I do communication device evaluations, and a lot of times they're saying, well, my son is using somebody else's AAC in the classroom all the time. And that's when we realized, oh, I think he actually needs one, right? Like he's maybe on the autism spectrum and is speaking, but not really functionally. So because he was speaking, we didn't think he needed a device. And then when he when he used another piece of technology, we realized how more authentic language is coming out of that, how much more functional language is coming out of that. It's almost like they stumbled on it because someone else in the classroom had an AAC device, right?
Right.
I think the great thing about these documents is that they're coming out at the national level. And obviously IDEA also is national level. And then we have the states where the WAC or we have states that are have laws around IDEA that are parallel or should be using the same verbiage. But I do feel like that there's great discrepancy from state to state on the acquisition of AAC or assistive technology. And I think that's probably the challenge nationwide is the oversight on making sure that there's equitability everywhere. Do you guys see that problem?
I think that we do need to think about the fact that in every state and in each community, like they bring their own context, right? And their own culture and their own community. So yes, I mean, it's consistently an issue with how do we disseminate information and get information down to the end user? How do we get information to the teams that are making IEP, individualized education program decisions, or IFSPs for our birth through toddlers? How do we get the information to those people so that they can make the most informed decisions? And I also think that part of that is how do we make sure that we have a prepared and diverse workforce who not only understand about assistive technology, but are model users of the same types of technology that we know will be available for our children and our students to use. So I see it as, yes, an area that needs improvement and also an area of great promise in that as we build these diverse workforces, as we have educators and providers who represent the communities that they serve, whether they're educators of color, whether they're educators with disabilities or providers with disabilities, they're providers who live and work in the communities, all of that helps us build a better system where we learn from each other and help support each other in growing. Now, I think that's incredibly important because in the United States, 25% of us has a disability at some point in our adulthood. When you think about that, 1 in 4 of us, right? Like that means we have to change the way that we set up systems and the way that we interact with each other and the different types of tools and ways that we can do that.
Right.
And so the promise that we have here in communicating with each other and using technology to make our lives easier, which I think we're all very good at, right? Like figuring out that part. That's the same type of tools that we can use to help us learn better and perform better as well.
I love that. And I love how earlier you called it a workaround for yourself, right? It's a workaround. And we all have things that we're using as a workaround for certain things. And then for students who have disabilities, how wonderful that, like you said, we can model those as adults. I was just talking to my daughter who started in a new 8th grade gen ed classroom, and she mentioned live transcript captioning during her math class. And I talked to her teacher and she said, oh yeah, I learned about that as an AT trick, but I use it with all my students. And I just thought how wonderful of an example of universal design that she's using from day one, and it's going to help so many more students than she might even know. What would you say are some guiding principles that have endured in the field of special education, regardless of the advancements in technology?
Definitely. I'm going to start with what I think is like the premise, right? Which is that all students, every single student can learn when they're provided instruction that meets their needs in a safe, secure, supported environment. So let's go back to like, we all have the opportunity to learn and grow, regardless of our age, regardless of our background, it's there for us. So I'm going to start there. Like we can all learn. The second one is that learning needs to be planned for and provided by a skilled teacher, someone who works with the learner to create the system of supports that is most conducive to that learner and their learning. So this is not about like using AI to replace an instructor or using
Right.
assistive technology in place of teacher-led instruction. Like there is a human element to this that is
Yes.
still needed.
Yes.
Um, we also the premise behind IDEA in that individualized learning, right? Whether it's an IFSP or an IEP that is that addresses the needs of the student, of the child, and is developed by a team that includes the parent, is something that I think that regardless of technology, we cannot get past. We have to keep that team-centered planning in place. And it's critical, right, to set those goals and go back and look at those. And we also know that technology, when used appropriately, can support learning and progress and growth by helping to customize instruction, but it doesn't replace it. And
Mhm.
so, I think the opportunities that we have available to us with online learning, hybrid learning, in person learning supplemented by, programs and opportunities. All of those things provide us with like a myriad of opportunities that we have not always had available.
Right.
Just this past week, I was out visiting states with the Secretary's bus tour, and I got to hear about some amazing welding programs going on in the state of Pennsylvania.
Mhm.
And they were talking about the fact that they're using technology to give hands-on practice with welding before the student is actually like using an actual welder. So they can like try it out, try lots of things, see what works, what doesn't work before they pick up the tool and use it. And what a great opportunity. Like, I can't even imagine like being able to have that level of involvement and opportunity in my learning. Like, I think back to when I was in high school, and the closest thing that we had available was like a driver's ed simulation,
Sure.
right? And remember how exciting that was? Like when you got to sit in the fake car and try that. And so I think like, wow, if I would have had all of these opportunities to try some different career things out, what might have happened to my career trajectory? What
Right.
might I have decided to do as a result? So I think that that is some of the very cool aspects that we have available to us with technology is the opportunity to enhance and increase our learning, but not replace the humanistic aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. I love
Yeah,
that.
and I think that the trend for the AI is exciting, and I think there's a great opportunity, but I love that you're highlighting like this does not replace the human connection factor, right? And we are constantly assessing by observation, human to human, about what a student, especially that's not functionally verbal, is struggling with, and how we can adjust the environment to better meet their needs. And that's a human factor that just can't be replaced, right?
Right. Well, and I think there are so many opportunities where if I'm struggling with communication, technology can give me lots of opportunities to practice communication in a safe place,
Right.
to look at alternate methods of communicating my needs. But it doesn't say communication isn't important, right? So it doesn't excuse me or make it so that I don't have to communicate. It meets me where
Right.
I'm at and helps me move forward.
Right.
Right. I think funding is the biggest issue with acquiring some of the more expensive AAC like eye gaze and more the powered mobility, right? Expensive ways for mobility. And no matter which way you look at it, funding's always an issue, I feel like. But I know here in Arizona, we started a little program where children got to, we figured out how to do some funding to train them, like get in a power chair, try it. Because they're going to go and fail the driver's test. I mean, let's be real. If you didn't drive a car and then you had to take a driving test, you're probably going to fail it, right? And then for a child, that means you just get a manual chair, but and then you get reevaluated in 5 years or something. But it's like, what if we had what now we can set up some programs and set up some short-term funding where you can practice driving a wheelchair with a head array or a joystick, and seeing if this is something that's going to work, as opposed to just always going to the lower tech option because we don't have a trial period and things like that. So I think that now that as technology becomes more and more available to us as therapists, we can trial things and do a better job at kind of feature matching, right? Someone's disability with the technology that's required. And I don't know that that is always easy in the schools, because sometimes they don't have access to the technology that they need to trial things.
Right. Well, and the Myths and Facts document does talk about the ways that you can access some different funding
Yeah.
sources. But
Yeah.
I think that one of the things to remember is that there are multiple funding sources that can be used here, right?
Right.
There are IDA funds, there are state funds, there are funds available from the 21st Century Technology Act.
Yeah.
I feel like it has a better name than that. I'm going to have to look that up. But there's all of these funding sources that are available that we tend to use in the same ways, right? And repurpose rather than really explore ways that we can use them more effectively and more
Right.
efficiently.
Yeah.
So many states do have, a center where things can be tried out.
Right.
Yeah.
I know depending on size and scale of districts and intermediate agencies, there are lots of opportunities to try things in that way. And there's also an issue between like what is required under IDEA for assistive technology versus something that may not be required, but may be beneficial in a different way, right? And so all of those things have to be considered. But what I think is important here is to remember that there's an opportunity to provide input, right? And when we think about, I talked about the importance of parents being involved in IFSPs and IEPs, but there's a need for people with disabilities and people who are on families of people with disabilities to be involved in all levels of the educational system to represent those needs, so that as we're designing budgets, as we're working with school boards, as states are submitting their budget proposals for IDA funds, all of these things are being considered and are being included in those budget plans, those budget proposals, the generation of laws, all of those things. And I think there's something to be said for being innovative too, and thinking about what is it that I can do differently? What is something I can use that will impact many students in their learning, even though there isn't such a high cost, right? Like using artificial intelligence for live transcribing. When you think about the capacity there and like note taking, right? Verbal transcription, voice to text, all of those things that used to be really costly that are now not so costly. And so I think that a lot of times we think about like the high cost, super fancy tools that as time goes by become low cost, more readily available. And how do we pick up on those, right? Like how do we capitalize on that?
Yes.
Right.
And they're sometimes low cost, but also can be pretty quick to do in the moment, which I think is another important part.
I think the fact too that if we start designing things from that universal design aspect on the front end, we can make sure that they come with tools or that they're born accessible, right? That we don't have to retrofit things at great cost after the fact.
Exactly.
So if I'm a district, if I'm a state and I'm building those things into my purchasing contracts, and when I buy technology, when I buy curriculum or instructional materials, when I make those decisions about professional development and professional learning for my schools and my families, like am I identifying and purchasing things that are already born accessible, that are going to meet the needs of my diverse community, and are more likely to be impactful at that point.
Right. Like in the beginning, when I was introducing you, Glenna, I mentioned one of your impacts in Washington with kind of making sure that we're not working in silos. And you alluded to that with the teams. Who's on the team? It's the parent. And in the same way, to make things universal, we need to make sure we're having the technology folks on the teams and the teaching and learning folks on our teams, right? And that's a great way to make sure these things are happening from the beginning.
Definitely.
I was just the Ability Expo here in Arizona this weekend and listening to people with disabilities that are running their own booths talking about the things that they've created or at least had a voice in creating. And it was shocking how many people were like, so a fully capable body made this thing thinking it was great until my body got in it. And actually, I can't reach that. Right? Like, actually, I can't run this. Actually, I still need another person to, I mean, something fairly simple. There's a woman who was like, she has a wheelchair. She was in 8th grade. She got in a bathroom. She transferred herself into the bathroom, but the backpack was so heavy, it tipped the wheelchair. And then she sat there for 2 hours waiting for someone to notice she was missing because she couldn't actually re-up it. So she made these little bags that go on the side of the wheelchair that she can put her things on that doesn't change the center of gravity of her chair. And I was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? And I just a simple of example of it's like we need to be listening to the people who are actually using the technology on the daily to see the things that make it challenging to. I sometimes somebody will be showing me something and I'll be like, so you have to do that. Even, an able-bodied person has to hit this button in order for, right? It's like we just keep looking at, if we keep looking at this from a point of only our angle, we're missing ways to increase independence and on a bigger scale. And that is really where employment is, right? Is like that breach that into employment is like, well, do I have to hire someone to help you do this job? Right? It's like, how does this work? But we have to be looking at from start to finish. Can the technology be accessed independently?
Well, and I think it means we have to reshape how we think about things too, because we tend to think about things like, did we do it right or were we wrong? Right.
Mm.
And if something doesn't work well, we think, oh, we were wrong. We don't view it as an opportunity to make it better.
Yeah.
And so, if we think about things as like, this is what I knew right now, but what I know tomorrow, I'm going to do differently. And when I learn more, I'm going to do it differently. So I always, when I'm out speaking, I always kind of end with a Maya Angelou quote that says, like, when you know better, do better.
Sure.
But I think that's really how we have to gear things. Like you have to start somewhere. You can't be afraid to not start because you haven't done everything possible, right? But then, like, we need to think about, like, what are the things that other people need? Like, the world is not just revolving around me and, only me. So what are the other things that are helpful to people? And how is it that we engage in those conversations? And we do that early and often as we're making decisions rather than kind of digging in and being like, nope, I made a decision and I'm sticking with it. And so when I think about that, I think like, what is it that we have to do to be creative? And I think like we can't perpetuate the system that we've created that gives us poor outcomes. Like we have to say, no, you know what? Individuals with disabilities are capable of anything if we provide them the supports and if we allow them to learn and demonstrate their capability. That doesn't mean we should reduce our expectations. It doesn't mean we can remove access to learning from them by not allowing them within a general ed classroom or access to rigorous standards-based instruction that's supplemented by specialized instruction. But it does mean that we are responsible for designing a system of intentional academic and behavioral supports. And when we know better, we need to do better. We have to be responsive to adapting the environment that our student exists in, but not at the expense of using evidence-based practices, of analyzing data and making informed decisions, right, to adjust that instruction. So we live in this amazing possibility of this rapid advancement in technology. But we have to step back and think like, okay, how do I use this to effectively build and increase real world skills that lead to competitive integrated employment, right? In a career of their choice. So like for me, like this is moving aside those outdated models of like building faux stores where people practice
Right.
skills without any interaction,
Mhm.
with the population. It gives us an
Right.
opportunity to build in lots of practice opportunities, to build in ways to recall information quickly, using technology to communicate differently and potentially more effectively. But when it comes down to it, we still have to use this to advance learning and create growth opportunities, not use it as a way of avoiding learning or saying
Mhm.
that student doesn't need to learn something.
Mhm.
So, how is it that we take a step back as educators, as parents, as individuals ourselves, and say, how do we build this system? This system, and I've been calling it the system of persistent equity. How do we build a system that is so responsive and has the supports needed that every child has all of their needs met? Like,
Mhm.
when do we stop saying only certain children
Right.
Mhm.
Right.
get specialized instruction? And so,
Right.
how is it that we use these tools that are available to us that for many of us are in our pockets or in our handbags, right? How do we use these things and use them to advance outcomes?
Mhm.
Technology can provide all sorts of accommodations and supports or workarounds. The issue is we have to be able to try it out. And people with disabilities are usually early adopters of
Right.
technology,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Because we're like, oh, that's going to help with this,
Yeah.
right? And so, how do we leverage that and use that to benefit everybody?
In using the early adopters takes me to kind of Simon Sinek's and all that vocabulary, and there's always the laggards, right? In
Right.
using right, there's always the naysayers, and I don't honestly, I think that we've had a lot of general ed teachers get really excited about inclusion and the technology that maybe could help with inclusion, but no matter what, the statistics say that there's going to be laggards in every step of the way here. What do you think is critical in assisting the mindset shift you're talking about?
So I think the only way that we can do that we can shift mindsets, are to give people the opportunity to have these conversations, to see the potential and to
Mhm.
see how these decisions impact people. Um, you know, like I said, this is about like what Maya Angelou says, when you know better, do better. And
Mhm.
I routinely, I believe from the very depths of my being that people go into education because they want to help children learn
For
and they want
sure.
to help families and their
Yeah.
communities be successful.
Yes.
And then we put barriers. We support barriers for that happening, whether intentionally or
Mhm.
non-intentionally. And so when we have people who are like, I don't see that vision, I can't do it because of this, we have to get to like, what is it we're trying to accomplish? How do we make that the easier thing to do? I'm reading this book right now called The Friction Project, and it talks about how do you make the right things easier and the wrong things harder,
Ooh.
right? And
Mhm.
so I know, so I've been kind of thinking through like, what are the outcomes that we want to see, and how do we put those supports in place? And unfortunately, I think that frequently we try to go in and we try to build a siloed system in which we have separate funds, we have separate
Yeah.
services, we have separate people, and then we expect them to all work together seamlessly across those systems while we have set them all up as separate issues.
Right.
So the only way to get past that is to have those conversations, to say, what is it we're trying to accomplish together and how do we do that? And how does my work impact your work? How does what we both do impact the student? And how do we hear from the people that we're impacting as to what it does for them, the successes and their areas of concern? I
Mhm.
know
And
for me, I think back to the students that I've worked with and the lessons that they've taught me,
mhm.
right? That it's not all one-sided. It's not me only teaching them. They have taught me just as much.
Oh, for
They have
sure.
taught me, that I talked to them about needing time for me to regroup, and yet I wasn't potentially giving them the same time, right?
Mhm.
And that I need to think about that I need to think about the vocabulary I use when I'm frustrated, that I need to think about what they need to be supported moving forward. And so all of those things have helped me be not only a better teacher, but a better person.
Yeah.
And I think we don't talk about that frequently, right? We think we have to come across as the experts and as knowing it all and doing it all well. And we forget to talk about the fact of when we made a misstep or when we learned a lesson or what it was like.
Yes.
I think one of the things that I think about a lot with individuals with disabilities is that we view it as a failure when they switch, when they try out a job and it's not the job for them, right? But that's really much a very fact of life. Like, think about your very first job. Like, my very first job in high school was working at Baskin Robbins. Like, I am so thankful that I am no longer working at Baskin Robbins for many, many reasons. But I have tried out so many jobs, you know, as I was in high school and in college, and even as a teacher, I switched, you know, what subjects I taught and the population of people. And I learned from all of it and I grew. And so why is it that we deny other people those same opportunities or view that as not, you know, something positive?
Well, that's a great point.
Because just because something comes to an end doesn't mean that it wasn't valuable, right?
Right.
And so I think that the this is how we've always done it is kind of the enemy of a lot of things right now. But it's like, so going, yes, this is how we've always done it, and change can be hard and scary, but change can also be moving everyone forward. So this is one way to do that. The other thing I think about is that it is what you were talking about is like once we kind of braid the funding, right, then we actually braid the services, right? So then we're kind of allowed to collaborate and we get people from the different disciplines to look at the whole body, the whole situation, the whole environment. And that's where we best served the whole human being, you know.
And I love what you've said, Glenna, about just kind of moving our field forward, moving ourselves forward as people involves creativity. It involves problem solving, which I think a lot of us enjoy. In whatever career you have, you need to do problem solving. And certainly in education, a lot of problem solving. I think that's kind of neat. And we can embrace that, is what you're saying, as we're looking at technology and as we're looking at what is going to help a student or an adult with a disability. That problem solving and things getting a little messy, and that's okay, right? We make mistakes and that's okay, and we're going to talk about it. Certainly as a parent of a teenager, I know that one of the only times she'll really tune is and when I say, oh, I really wasn't doing that right. I should have given you some time, whatever. And then she's like, oh, right. So
I know, she's like, wait a minute, tell me more, Mom.
Yeah. And yeah, so I think we can all relate to that. I really love that message. As we wrap up, we'd love to know maybe something that people might not know about you that you want to share, or if you have a new project coming up.
This one was a tough question, I'm going to tell you. So I'm trying to think. There are so many things that I would love to share that I can't share because they're mid-process. But I could say one of the things I think I really appreciate about this opportunity is the fact that I get to work with really committed people who serve in a variety of roles, right? So we have policy advisors, we have legal experts, we have content specialists, we have families and advocates, and then people who are training, you know, our educators, our providers, and then our higher ed, you know, system itself. And so we have all of these pieces of the system that supports individuals with disabilities across all ages. And the opportunities that come up where we can just sit down and really examine data and research and identify how we're going to move forward. Like, what is our strategy going to be? And for me, like, that is what makes this job worth doing. because there are times when I have to say, like, no, that's not what the law says. And I would love to be able to do that, but I can't.
Mhm.
Right. And yet behind the scenes, we have these opportunities, the suggestions to think about, like, where is the future? What do we want to see happen?
Right.
And have conversations with the myriad of people who make those decisions
Yeah.
so that we're not static, that even if we can't solve a problem right now, we can't resolve an issue right now, it doesn't mean it's never going to be resolved.
Right.
And to me, it's that hope, right? That we see impact now and we're working on long-term impact. And
Mm.
then just hearing the success stories of the people that we work with, right? Seeing our infants and toddlers learn and grow and be successful, and
Right.
people graduating high school and going on to post-secondary education and career, and telling us about their successes, what helped them, what didn't help them, so that we can replicate that and, increase it. To me, that is what makes this work worthwhile. And it takes all of us. It takes you, having these conversations and identifying these resources, working with schools, working with families, and getting everybody to have these conversations. We all have a role that we need to play.
Definitely. Well, Glenna, I know anytime I've had a meeting I've been in a meeting with you when you were in Washington State, I just kind of left feeling a little more excited, a little hopeful about what we're doing. And I definitely feel that way right now. Brenda, I'm sure you're feeling that way too. It's just,
Yes, yes.
we're so happy to be able to talk to you, and we're thrilled that you're the person in this position
Yeah, thank
and
you.
making these impacts.
One of the things that I think is most helpful is giving people a way to make an impact, right? So encouraging them, families, to work within their communities, to work within their state special ed advisory councils
Mhm.
or their inter coordinating councils for our infants and toddlers, working with their school boards, their state school boards, like speaking up and providing that input and making sure that the needs of their students are considered in all aspects is key to creating the system of persistent equities that we're looking for.
Thank you so much for your time, and we really appreciate the conversation today.
We really do. Thank you so much.
The contents of this podcast were developed under contract with the Washington Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, U.S. Department of Education, and administered by Central Washington University. However, those contents did not necessarily represent the policy of the OSPI and CWU, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal and state government.